It happened in a cold, cobalt flash. The room went thin, sound narrowed to a humming behind my teeth. He was there, impossibly tall, light like melted glass. His 3 eyes folded into the dark of me, and I felt them read every unpaid bill, every swallowed hope. "You will live in abundance," he said into my mind, the tone metallic and gentle. "But first you will send light to those who wish you harm." His fingertip brushed my forehead. My cells sang in a language I had never known. "Would you believe me if I said that blessing your enemies unlocked the door to everything you long for?" I had lived half a century in the small echo of other people's success. I am Sergio Torres. I sold houses I could not afford. I polished promises that were never mine. The apartment I rented smelled of old coffee and damp cardboard. Mornings began with the cracked mirror in the tiny bathroom and my own thin voice. "Today something will change," said like a talisman I no longer trusted. The mirror only reflected the tired, the creased map of my face. The radiator rattled. The hallway outside smelled of frying oil and someone else's laundry. My breath came shallow. My chest felt heavy, as if grief had been folded there and sewn in. I kept the unpaid notices in a stack on the bed, an island of paper that made me smaller each night. I counted possibilities the way one counts coins. There were not enough. My ex-wife, Diana, married Eduardo, my former partner. They walked the streets in cars polished to a promise. When I saw them, the world dimmed. Rage tasted metallic. I would scrub the image from my mind, but it returned like a bruise. At 52, hope had become a ritual of small lies to myself. I made lists at the kitchen table. I rehearsed reasons to leave, plans to start again. Each plan wore thin before coffee time. Sleep came in small, brittle sections. I would wake to the street light through the blinds and roll over another hour of failure in my head. My hands trembled when I tried to sign a paper. My palms knew the texture of rejection. The bank sent an ultimatum, eviction in 15 days. I remember the envelope as if it were an accusation. The thermostat of my life dipped. The air in the apartment tasted colder than the city outside. I sat on the edge of the bed and asked, aloud to whatever would listen, for a hand to take mine. I had not asked the universe for anything in years. I had been too proud for asking, and too ashamed to beg. I want you to know how ordinary the moment was. The light switch squeaked. My socks had holes. Somewhere a television laughed. I put my hands on my knees and breathed until the room stopped spinning. I whispered a plea, not a prayer, in a language I knew, but a sound like a cracked radio calling for reception. There is something to say here for those still watching. I am grateful you stayed. This channel is new. Every subscription helps us reach 1,000. If this story lands and you write your city and country in the comments, your presence matters more than you know. That night, the room cooled as if winter had moved in a week early. The window glass thinned with cold sweat. The fluorescent bulb buzzed like an insect. And then the sound began, a low, steady hum that pressed against the bones behind my ears. The air felt thicker near the door, as if the hallway had folded into the room. I was aware, suddenly, of every frayed thread on the blanket beneath me. I did not see him arrive. The light simply gathered, like water finding the shape of its vessel. A cobalt seam of brightness stitched itself across the wall. The hair on my arm stood up in a line, each follicle a lightning rod. My heartbeat accelerated into my throat. There was a pressure gentle and absolute on the center of my chest, as if someone had placed a palm there and spoke into my bones. He shaped himself from light, limbs elongated, joints bending with a grace I could not name. The skin, if I can call it, that was translucent, lattice work of geometry that breathed. His eyes were not two. They were three, arranged like a compass that points inward. They held more dark than any human eye, as if whole skies sat behind them. He did not step. He resolved into presence. When he spoke, the sound arrived inside my skull before my ears heard anything. It was a voice that bypassed language, metallic, calm, with the echo of a cathedral bell. "Your tears have thinned the membrane," he said. We come when the heart fractures, because only then is there room for the true pattern. I tried to answer. My mouth opened like a rusty gate, and no words came. My throat vibrated with the memory of every apology I'd swallowed. My whole body felt retuned to a frequency that had no place in the city. The light from him painted the cheap wallpaper in shades I had no names for. My skin prickled, cool then hot, like being walked through a storm and into a sun. He lifted a hand, and on the inside of his wrist symbols glowed: triangles, spirals, lines that pulsed like tiny circuits. I felt older than I had any right to feel, and younger than I imagined possible. "What you call miracles," he said, "are laws you have forgotten." The phrase landed with the weight of a dropped coin in a deep well. Then he touched me. The tip of something cool and liminal brushed my forehead. It was not painful in the way of knives. It was an electric rewrite. A current like a river ran under my skin. Images flashed: my childhood kitchen, voices of my parents like distant radio, the first house I ever sold, the day Diana left. Not memory exactly, but threads rearranging toward a new pattern. It felt like being translated. I slept after that, or something like sleep. When I woke, the room was the same room and not the same at all. My wrist bore a mark, a blue sign, a triangle circled, alive in the way a fire glows. I touched it and felt a warmth like a small, contained sun. The hum in my head had become a rhythm I could follow. I tested the mark. I closed my eyes and imagined the phone ringing with an offer. I let my chest fill with the gratitude as if the call were already made. I did not bargain. I recognized. 10 minutes later, the phone vibrated. It was a client, an old listing in distress, offering an advance commission if I could move quickly. I wrote down the detail with hands that were not shaking like before. Coincidence? Maybe. But the coin had a new shine. That night, he returned. He hovered in the doorway, as if watching a pilot light. The apartment smelled faintly of rain, even though it had not rained. "You begin to sense," he said, and his voice was less distant now, as if we shared a wall. "Reality answers tone, not mere wish. Feeling is the thread, thought is the needle." He unfolded the idea with a clarity I could feel with my teeth. He proposed the test, then sharp as a clean blade. "Bless them," he said. "For 7 mornings, bless those who cut you. Not as a ruse, not as a show. Transform the knot in your chest into light and send it to them." I laughed, then short, brittle because it sounded obscene. "They ruined me," I said aloud. "How do I send them light?" "Because," he answered, "while you tighten the rope around your future, you hold the pattern of lack. Prosperity cannot pass through a closed hand." My resistance was immediate and sincere. I could recite the ledger of their betrayals. I could paint a mural of my losses. Yet something in the bruise of my chest softened at the thought of release. I promised him nothing. I promised myself only the attempt. So I began. Each morning for 7 days, I sat at the edge of the bed. Preparation, the window open a fraction, the smell of the city sharp and real. I took 3 breaths long, deliberate until my lungs felt like bellows. I focused on the people who had harmed me. The images that rose were jagged, raw: Eduardo's narrow smile, Diana's folded hand in someone else's. I let the memory be heavy, and then, intentionally, I painted over it with light. I imagined a gold thread wrapping them, not to change their deeds but to free my own chest. I said aloud, clumsy at first, "I bless your journey. May you find ease. May your days hold peace." I repeated it even when my belly clenched and I tasted bitterness. Some mornings the words stuck in my throat. Sometimes I cried, a small, honest rupture. On the 3rd day, the words began to sound less like a lie. On the 5th day, my hand stopped trembling when I touched the stack of bills. On the 7th day, I wept so cleanly it felt like pruning. That night, the symbol at my wrist flared and then settled into a steady glow. There was no trumpet, no fanfare, just a softness in my chest that I had not felt in years. The apartment felt lighter, as if someone had opened a window I did not know existed. Of course I spoke then, in the dark, the voice less a voice now and more like a remembered melody whispered. The cage of others' approval is a choice you keep making. Which shall you choose, their safety or your own release? I breathed and chose release, as if choosing to exit a room that had kept me distracted for decades. A new test arrived in my inbox the next morning, an official notice from the bank confirming the auction of my apartment in 3 days. The future condensed into a date. I sat on the floor and let the world narrow to the hum in my ears and the draft under the door. I closed my eyes and began the practice deeper than before. Preparation. I lay flat, the mattress springs like small complaint beneath me. I breathed until my belly rose and fell like a slow tide. I pictured a home solid, warm, wood underfoot, a kitchen that smelled like baking, a garden where wind moved the leaves like applause. I did not ask. I recognized. The difference was a muscle suddenly remembered. That house exists where I now stand in certainty, I told the air. I do not ask, I know. I repeated it until the phrase settled into my bones. Hours later my phone rang. Ricardo Navarro, a client I'd not seen in years, his voice crisp as an envelope. He needed me to manage properties while he moved overseas. He had a house he needed off the books and fast. He said my name the way people say something when they remember a favor owed. 2 hours later, I signed papers for a house that looked and felt like the vision I'd held. The keys were cold in my palm. The house smelled faintly of cedar and possibility. I stood on the tiled foyer and felt a release so profound my knees shook. The debt on my chest dissolved like salt in rain. The symbol on my wrist warmed and then smoothed into skin. I did not feel like I had been given something by chance. I felt like I had been shown a mirror that finally reflected what I had learned to hold inside. But the lesson did not end in a mansion. It reshaped my speech, my posture, the quiet of my mornings. I learned words that changed how the world responded. I learned to say, I am already, more than I hope. I learned that feeling is the signal and thought is the pointer. As this chapter closed, something else opened. I still wonder sometimes, was Zayla's an emissary from another world, or a form of my own higher sense making contact? Perhaps the distinction does not matter. What matters is the change, from constriction to a practiced openness. The real test of any new understanding is, life will it hold when the city pushes back? Will old faces and old systems try to rewrite me? The next days would tell. The next conversations would ask for demonstration. And I would have to answer not with rhetoric, but with the soft, steady command of a life rearranged. Mini cliffhanger. The world would not simply accept this without a question. Something wider was waking, and the first real resistance was about to speak. The night he came felt like the world halting for a single intake of breath. The air in my apartment turned cool as cellophane. I remember the sound, first a low drone that rolled under the windows, like a truck far away but constant, as if the earth itself hummed a note it had been saving. My skin pricked. My knees, which had grown used to the giving way of expectation, steadied. The light pooled and then drew itself up into form. Zayla's did not enter. The room made room for him. The temperature near my face dropped. When he spoke, the syllables arrived as images more than words. You have been trained to trade your power for evidence, he said, and the sentence landed like an arrow. You will learn to trade feeling for form. There was a curious cleanliness to his presence, no clutter of idle advice, no soft-voiced platitudes. He presented concepts as if opening drawers in a desk, and each drawer contained a small, precise tool. He spoke, "We do not change your fate. We show you how you speak to the field." He laid out the rule and paradox. Not thought alone, but the feeling that floods the thought. Not wanting, but being. He moved in small gestures, and each gesture made the light in the room bend differently. At one point he reached toward a cracked poster on my wall, an ad from some open house I'd shown, and the hairline fissure on the print flared bright for a moment, then healed as if repaired by a memory. I asked him about fear. He tilted his head. and I saw galaxies turn on the rims of his eyes. Fear is a registration, he said. It records a possibility as if it were law. You have the habit of recording scarcity. His words were simple, not lecturing, more like handing me a map. He taught me a practice that could be repeated anywhere. Preparation, breathe so the body slows. Action, find the smallest truth you can own and let it swell into feeling. Effect, listen for the first nuance of response, a shift in breath, a softening in the room, a call, a message. Reflection, keep the observation brief and tender. He called it the measurement of the felt. We did a small experiment. He asked me to think of a cup of hot coffee on my table and to feel the gratitude I would have if it were already there. I felt the heat at the tongue of my mind, like a stolen warmth. The hum in the apartment shifted. The radiator clacked in a different rhythm. The kettle in the building downstairs clicked as if echoing me. 10 minutes later, a knock came at my door, an old neighbor offering sugar because her power had flickered. Small, measly, but undeniable. The feeling had bent reality's ear. He spoke in aphorisms, short, enigmatic, impossible to reduce to a formula. You think yourself small because you name your lack. Name the abundance, and your hands will unclench. The pauses after his lines were long enough to let meaning percolate. There were intimations of cost. He never spoke of free rides. The price, he said, was willingness, the willingness to practice in the face of ridicule, to keep the inside intact when the outside mocked. He told me, there will be voices that want to keep the map as it is. They will say you are deluded. You must be willing to appear foolish. I practiced in small ways. I used the method on a sore tooth and felt the jaw relax. The ache did not vanish in a miracle, but softened as if given room. I used it on a late tenant payment and watched timelines shift as human schedules reconfigured. I used it on a recurring dream of failure, and the dream's edges dulled. Each success asked for less striving and more steady state. The body learned to hold certainty like an inhabited room. My mornings began with a brief loop. I am home in the world. The world is home for me, said aloud. Felt in the sternum, released as if setting a key into a lock. On the street, I noticed color return to faces. Conversations gained a reserve of ease that had been absent for years. Resistance arrived like a familiar guest. Mario called again, now with a sharper worry. People in my life offered explanations, a lucky break, an opportunistic client, but they could not feel the small recalibrations inside me. My exes were unaffected on the surface. They continued the life they'd chosen. That in itself was a test. Could I hold the new inside when the old outside remained unchanged? I learned a new vocabulary of interior speech. Instead of bargaining with possibility, I recognized it. I would say, in the quiet, I recognize abundance. I live in recognition. I felt the phrase anchored differently than any hopeful plea I had ever uttered. It began to shape the way the world answered. One afternoon, I received an invitation that felt like a probe. Ricardo asked me to meet at the estate he was about to sell. The house was larger than my old vocabulary for belonging. I walked through rooms that smelled of old wood and planning. I touched the banister and felt a memory unspool of a man I might yet become. Ricardo's eyes were calm, and in them I saw no calculation, only the quiet weight of someone letting something effortless pass. Signing the papers was not like the signing of a contract. It felt like aligning a seam. My hands did not shake. When I left, the sun was generous and the driveway smelled of crushed stone and lemon trees. The house was mine in a way that felt less like possession and more like recognition of a pattern I had unlocked. When Zalas came for the last time in that city room light, he stood by my window and seemed to watch the world learn its new rules through me. He did not speak much. His presence was the kind that rearranged space. I asked him simply, why me? He did not answer with explanations. He said something that felt like a stone set down. You were in the right kind of ache. That kind opens doors. Others may ache. Not all will open. We choose where to lean our attention. Before the light left him, He gave me something small, a crystal of smoked blue. But I can say what changed inside me. The hands unclenched, my gaze steadied. I moved through the world with a simple daily habit. Breathe, declare a truth, sit in the feeling of it as if it were already done. I speak to you now from the veranda of a house whose floors remember sun. The crystal sits on my table, catching light and throwing small geometry across the plaster. Sometimes at dawn I think of the cold room where I first called into the dark. I am not the man who begged in emptiness. I am someone who learned to become an instrument, a place where possibility resonates. Loop affirmation I use when doubt comes. I am the signal that draws my life. I am steady in recognition. I am home in the possible. Mini cliffhanger. The work of recognition is not private forever. When you learn to command the field, it asks you what will you craft next. The morning after the touch, the room smelled of old coffee and wet cardboard, but the air felt different, thicker, as if someone had threaded velvet through the light. I blinked against the pale sun that crawled across the plaster and saw the mark on my wrist. A small blue triangle inside a circle, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath skin. My fingers hovered over it. The skin was warm. The mark hummed faintly against my pulse. I sat very still and listened to the room. The radiator sighed. A distant radio murmured a soap opera. My chest held something I could not name, an expectant silence, like the held breath before a performance. I pressed the pad of my thumb into the triangle and felt a fine vibration, as if the mark answered to attention. The voice of Zayla's threaded through me. Each thought is a seam. So with feeling, and the field will follow. Incredulous, I decided to test the seam. I pictured my phone ringing with an offer that would breathe air into my dying month. I imagined the tone, the exact cadence of gratitude when I picked up. I let the feeling of that gratitude sit in my sternum until it felt like bone. 10 minutes later, the phone buzzed. A woman I had sold a small apartment to years ago was calling. She needed help with a foreclosure. She offered an advance. My hands, which had been thin with tremor for months, began to steady while I listened. The world had not exploded. It had simply rearranged itself toward the shape I had held. The first test was small, so I made smaller tests. I sat at my kitchen table and felt for heat where there had been pain in my jaw. I breathed the warmth in, imagined the cheek relaxing like something unwound. Within an hour, the ache thinned to a dullness. Not a miracle. A room given a window. The neighbor's kettle downstairs clicked at the same time. I imagined steam rising. Coincidence wrenched at my old reasoning. The mark on my wrist thrummed as if amused. I began to understand the grammar. Sensation as command, feeling as the summons. When Zayla's returned that night, the apartment smelled suddenly like rain, though no cloud had crossed the sky. He hovered near the window, a clean silhouette against the city glow. He did not smile. He let silence sit between his lines. "You test like a child testing a shore," he said, and his voice was a bell struck softly. "Notice the first answer. Learn the tone required." He taught me how to prepare. It was startlingly simple. Slow the breath until the chest felt like a bellows releasing at a measured rate. Find a single, small truth you can hold without arguing. Let it swell into feeling. Watch for the world's first hint of response, a shift in a sentence, a softening of a look, a kettle click. Keep the observation brief, tender, then let go. I practiced that night on small things. An early rain on the balcony, a neighbor's return smile, the exact time a client would email me a document. Each small success tightened a quiet thread inside me. The mark dimmed and brightened like a tide. My cynicism receded not with thunder, but with the soft erosion of accumulated evidence. There were moments of absurdity. I once felt the certainty of a lost glove being found, an odd, domestic wish, and 20 minutes later the glove lay on the top step of the building, left by someone who must have gone upstairs and down again. I do not claim cosmic preferment for gloves, but the glove taught me humility about the field. It answered the tone you fed it. The pattern began to look less like magic and more like a conversation. A short note of what I learned that week. Feeling is the signal. Thought is the design. Attention is the broadcast. I rehearsed a little loop to steady myself when doubt arrived. I hold certainty. I breathe certainty. I am the seam. The words were small. They sat in my chest like a key. The next morning, before I could doubt my own lesson, something else happened, something that would ask for more than gentle experiments. The hum in my room changed pitch. The city sighed. The field leaned in. I felt it like a hand lifting the curtain over a stage. The real test was coming. Zayla's instruction was deceptively cruel in its tenderness. "Bless them for 7 mornings," he said. His 3 eyes blinked like a metronome. Not to change them, to change the channel inside you. My first reaction was fury sharp enough to make my throat raw. How do you send warmth to the people who sharpened your winter? I pictured Eduardo's smile as a knife. I pictured Diana's hand folding away from mine. I wanted justice. Zayla's face remained patient, like a clock that knew time would do its work. I began anyway. Each morning I prepared as he taught. I opened the window a fraction, feeling a sliver of street air cross the room. I sat at the edge of the bed. I breathed slow, counting to 6 in and 8 out until my ribs felt like bellows. I chose the smallest possible truth I could own. I do not want them to burn forever. I let that be the ember. Then I fed it with a line I spoke aloud, clumsy at first. May you find what you need. May your steps be gentle. The words felt ridiculous and thin, but I kept the posture heart forward, chest soft. Day 1 left me angry and dry-mouthed. The words scraped. Nothing moved. A week of mornings ahead felt like a far mountain. On day 2, a memory loosened. I saw Eduardo in a flash, not as the man with a briefcase, but as a young boy carrying a ripped soccer ball. The image did not absolve him. It softened the ridge in me that had held him as villain. The blessing sounded less like a lie. The triangle at my wrist pulsed blue and slow, not mocking but patient. By day 3, my hands stopped trembling when I touched the stack of unpaid notices on the bed. The paper no longer felt like a noose around fingers. I began to fold the letters rather than grip them. A client called to confirm a showing at 10 and then again to postpone. The small noise of life rearranged. The world was not answering my blessing by surprising me with forgiveness from them. It answered by loosening my body's hold on the past. On the 4th morning, I tested the method on a different axis. I used it on money, less on the math, and more on the feeling of having ease in the pocket. I sat at the kitchen table, palms down on wood, and declared the sensation I wanted, the lightness of being able to pay without looking at the due date. I colored that feeling with gratitude as if the payment had already been resolved. That afternoon, a tenant who habitually paid late transferred the rent in full with a message. "Sorry, old habit cleared now." Not providence, pattern. The practice asked me to be consistent, not spectacular. I wrote my own short loops that week. They were not slogans. They were anchors I could breathe into space. I repeated them under my breath as I moved through the day. I am the seam and the needle. I set the tone, and I let the world answer. I breathe ease into form. I send light where the hand used to clutch. On the 5th morning, I awoke weepy and calm. The act of blessing had become less theatrical and more mechanical, an honest muscle in my chest that could be flexed and left. My voice no longer stumbled. The words found their weight and settled. I felt oddly generous with air. The house of tension I'd lived in for years was being renovated, room by slow room. On the 6th morning, a small but unmistakable signal arrived. Eduardo called. The line felt strange, an intruder in the ritual of my morning. He spoke with a voice cracked by something I could not name: regret, perhaps, or a new worry. He asked a practical question about a property we once listed together. I answered with a clarity I had not used with him before. There was no apology, only a stiff businessness, and yet my chest did not clench. I had sent light down a pipeline, and what came back was not thunder. It was a loose, honest exchange. By the 7th morning, the act of blessing had made a new room inside me. I sat with the window open and said the line, then felt like cloth. May you find your way. May your steps be gentle. There was a cost implicit in the method, though Zayla's never framed it as punishment. The cost was the willingness to look foolish, to appear to strangers as a man speaking to air. Friends would mock. The press would say fortune favored the credulous. Yet something deeper shifted. The old habit of trading my dignity for others' approval fragmented. I felt smaller things, an easier posture, my shoulders lowering like curtains at the end of a play. The test accumulated, quietly, until the world would have no choice but to speak louder. I learned to keep my observations tender, not greedy. I learned a second loop, this one for when noise rose short, stubborn, like a prayer that had been polished into a tool. I hold ease. I breathe it. I let the world arrange. The loop fit my throat like a practiced note. The morning after the seventh blessing, the triangle on my wrist brightened like a lighthouse. But a different sound now threaded through the walls, a mechanical email ping that read like an ultimatum. The next step would not be a gentle experiment. The work would be asked to prove itself on the exact thing that had nearly taken me down. I felt the room tilt toward a threshold I had been avoiding. Flush with the strange successes, I made the mistake of using my friend Mario as a sounding board. We sat in the cafe under the train line. The espresso smelled of burned edges. I told him everything: the light, the touch, the mark, the 7 mornings of blessing. I wanted to see doubt soften on another face. I wanted an ally. Mario's brow folded in ways I knew well. He is a man of solid furniture, practical, skeptical, with hands that prefer transactions that balance on paper. His reaction was immediate and kinetic. "Sergio," he said, and the word landed like cold metal. "This reads like a breakdown dressed as a revelation. You need help." His accusation cut like a regular truth. I felt the old tremor return behind my ribs. The triangle at my wrist flickered, a shy ember. Doubt is contagious. It fetches friends' voices and uses them like mirrors. I walked home through streets I had begun to see with new light and felt like a man exposed. At the sink that night, I looked into the small, cracked mirror and felt myself as he might. A 52-year-old man clutching a story to keep the edges of shame at bay. The mark dimmed. I almost let the old narrative reclaim me, the comfortable story of failure. Old friends and regular judgments are heavy anchors. In that dark, Zayla's phrase arrived like a hand across my shoulder. The prison of others' opinions is self-built. Choose your exit. It was simple, not sermonizing. I thought of all the mornings I'd spent rehearsing smaller truths. I took a breath and said the loop aloud, not to change Mario but to steady myself. I hold ease. I breathe it. I let the world arrange. The next day the city did what cities do, oblivious, generous, small. The sign of the practice returned like a tide. A tenant called about a wiring issue and offered to pay 2 months in advance to have me prioritize repairs. A small landlord whose habits had been unreliably cold sent an email with a polite apology. The evidence mounted in the margin, not in headlines. Each response asked for less ritual and more steady state. But social resistance grew like shadow. A neighbor heard a snatch of my quiet practice and laughed in the stairwell. An old client, who speculated my past failure, asked about my sanity at a meeting, letting a room tilt into awkwardness. The world organizes itself around expectation. It resists sudden redefinition. People labeled me, and labels bite. The internal work became, simultaneously, proof and vulnerability. At the same time, because change is rarely neat, another current opened. Ricardo Navarro invited me to the estate he was selling. He walked with a cane now and moved like a man clearing his affairs. He spoke to me with the calm courtesy of someone who had counted the cost and decided to act. "Sergio," he said, "I remember the man who used to speak of houses as if they were possible bridges. I have a property I need moved. I wondered if you wanted to manage it." The words landed like rain on dry ground. I felt the old fear and a new steadiness wrestling under my ribs. As my life began to tilt toward the practical, the spiritual practice gathered critics and believers in equal measure. Mario stopped returning my calls for a while. Our friendship changed its contours. Some colleagues whispered of luck and strange bedside rituals. Diana and Eduardo continued their pattern of polite distance. Their phones did not ring with apology. They needed nothing from me. That acceptance, cold and clean, proved a different kind of freedom. Inside me, two tracks ran in parallel, one of softening, one of insistence. I practiced my loops at odd hours. I discovered an interior voice that guided action now instead of pleading. When a conflict with a contractor threatened to swallow a listing, I breathed and declared under my breath, I am steady in recognition. The negotiation reformulated, terms bending in a way that felt like the world listening for the pitch it recognized. There was, however, a real test waiting, one that would push the method to its limit. The bank had been patient until it ran out of patience. I knew they kept clocks that do not take heart rates into account. When the notice came, an official email scheduling an auction, I felt the old panic rise, quick and insistent. The mark on my wrist dimmed as if fearful. My reflection looked smaller in the mirror. Zayla's voice did not reappear with grand pronouncements. He offered instead a small, almost human instruction. When the stakes are sharp, do the quiet thing widely. Practice the felt in the face of the possible collapse. He told the truth of practice. It is not ornamental. It is operative. So I sat on the floor of that apartment and did what I had learned to do. The room smelled like old coffee and the city at dusk. I placed my hands on the floor to feel the solid. I breathed until the breath was slow enough to be a metronome. I visualized not a lucky escape, but the material feeling of safety would underfoot, a kettle on, the laugh of someone at a table. I did not ask. I recognized. I said aloud, the words small and certain. I am already home in the world. The world answers me when I speak from that steadiness. It felt then like stepping off a curb into flowing traffic and finding the car's part. Not fantasy, a reordering. The practice had thickened into confidence. Yet the city does not hand over outcomes without dispute. The next morning, the email that might have been period and end landed in my inbox like a question without punctuation. It read, a chance to meet Ricardo at an estate. A meeting. A conversation. The stakes were the same, but the world had moved the angle. Mario would not understand what I'd done in the quiet hours. He would call it luck, or worse, delusion. But some things are only visible in the body, the way the shoulders stop rising at every small sound, the way sleep returns like a tide. I had learned to hold my inside when the outside accused. There was a new sound at the edge of the apartment that night, a delicate, certain humming that I now recognized as the field rearranging in response to steadiness. It sounded like a throat clearing. The next day would ask the question plainly, would practice hold when the city demanded evidence? The answer would not arrive as a sermon. It would arrive as paper, signatures, keys, or loss. I slept with my palms folded over my chest, and for the first time in a long while, I let the sleep come like a guest who had finally found an invitation. The bank email sat in my inbox like a small, precise detonator. I read it 3 times, fingers cold on the screen, as if repetition could dissolve the schedule printed in data and law. The words were clinical, auction date, case number, contact. No malice in the letters, just a machine doing its work. My chest tightened in the same old rhythm, brief, shallow, like someone tapping the side of a bell that would not ring. I placed the phone face down on the table. The apartment smelled of old coffee and the faint sweet rot of the hallway trash. Outside, the city made its indifferent noise. A bus braking, a radio coughing, a dog that had learned the timetable of a neighbor's walk. I sat on the hardwood floor with my back to the wall, knees pulled close. The light through the curtain was yellow and narrow, a slit of ordinary daylight that felt like a decision. I breathed, counting silently. 4 in, 6 out. The breath is a simple instrument. I have learned to treat it like a tuning key. I remembered Zayla's instruction in a way that felt less like a memory and more like a scaffold being lowered into place. When the stakes are sharp, do the quiet thing widely. Two things happened that afternoon, small and concrete, that felt like the field replying in conversation rather than issuing miracles. A tenant who usually paid in drips called and asked if I could prioritize a repair, then offered 2 months rent up front as a thank you for reliability. Later, a client who had ghosted me for weeks sent a short email. Available tomorrow. Let's close. Nothing monumental. But the air in the apartment did not seem to expect collapse anymore. It awaited resolution. Still, the clock at the bank did not stop. The auction notice remained a drumbeat. I sustained the practice anyway, and the practice widened. I used it in negotiation, in scheduling, in the cold filing of paperwork that felt like a dry surgery on my life. Each time I repeated a phrase short, honed, not ornamental, I felt my body follow. For clarity, I made it a small liturgy. I hold ease. I let clarity lead. I allow the world to arrange. Saying those lines, over and over, was boring and brilliant. It taught my muscles how to stand. The second day after the email, Ricardo called. His voice was calmer than usual, a man who had counted his choices and decided to move forward. We met beneath the magnolias of his estate, the leaves smelling waxy and foreign to the city I lived in. He was smaller in person than in memory. Age had chiseled the same bones, but his posture still held that slow authority. Sergio, he said, I have to leave. The papers are messy and the deadline is not mine to move. I thought of you. He gestured toward the house behind him, stone, wide shutters, a gate that closed like a promise. My stomach dipped and lifted at once. The part of me that had rehearsed this image every night felt vindicated, and the part that was properly frightened braced. Why me? My voice was steadier than I expected. Because you spoke once about houses as bridges, he said. You believed. I need someone who can move things with care. The transfer is complicated, but I want you to manage the properties. The draft is written. We can sign these papers this afternoon if you want. The meeting room smelled of expensive paper and lemon oil. A clerk moved between us like a practiced current, sliding the documents across the leather table. I put my name where my name belonged. The ink bled briefly into the thread of the page, a small, ordinary miracle. When the pen left my hand, my palms were damp. My hand shook as if from cold, then steadied. I did not cry. My breath slowed. A different sound entered the room, quiet acceptance, as if the room itself had been waiting for a key. 2 hours later, I walked out with a folder heavier than the one I'd come in with. The deed was not yet a fully closed loop legalities. Taxes, the bank's clock, but the direction had changed. The pivot point had moved from absence to possibility. I went home and sat again on the floor, palm on wood, and said aloud the line that had begun as a claim and had become a fact inside me. I am already home in the world. It is tempting to call that the moment of salvation. It is not. The world is careful. It tests. On the morning after the signing, I opened my inbox to find not applause but a new sort of pressure. A polite email from a city department requesting documentation related to Ricardo's estate. Paperwork that demanded speed. Old systems find new work to keep the old fear busy. I could have unraveled there. Instead, I used the practice in real time. I breathed until my breath made the clock feel longer. I spoke the loop that had been my anchor but adjusted it for action. I speak from steadiness. I act from clarity. I let the facts follow. I read the document with patience and answered line by line, factual, calm. The clerk's response the next day thanked me for my promptness and clarity, and a small bottleneck dissolved. There is a kind of apprenticeship in this learning to let steadiness do the heavy lifting of panic. Practice is not magic. It is discipline. It is the refusal to let the old reflex of collapse win the day. The bank's auction remained on the calendar for another week, but the tightness in my chest had changed its shape. Where panic used to be a coiled animal beneath the ribs, it was now a cautionary friend that I could address by name, and then set gently on a mat. A quieter test arrived that same week. Mario called, his voice clipped, a tone of hurt that had nothing to do with the bank or the mansion. "I saw you with that man, Sergio," he said. "You can't tell me this isn't strange. How much of this is real? How much of this is you trying to outrun shame?" There it was, the old friction. The world's mirror lifted. In my chest, I felt the reflex to argue, to prove. Instead, I let something else happen. I inhaled, exhaled. I replied with the shortest, truest sentence I could find. "I choose my freedom over their approval." The line landed like a hinge. He paused, asking the questions he needed to ask. He did not accept my answer. He said what he feared. "If this is a game of words, it will end badly." "I'm not playing," I said. "I'm practicing a posture." We did not reconcile that day. Mario's absence was a cost. The field asks for proof, and the world often answers with suspicion. My wrist mark dimmed, as if unsure. That night I sat on the new hardwood floor of the house that might be mine and practiced the small liturgies until they were less like speeches and more like language my body remembered. The field responded in patient increments, a tenant's steady payment, a prompt reply from a legal office, a neighbor who cleared a misunderstanding with a nod. Many miracles, accumulated steadiness. 2 nights before the scheduled auction, I lay awake and felt the city breathing through the walls. The fear was there, not gone, but its pitch had shifted. It asked a different question. Could I stay in my body while the world did what it would? I answered with a practice that had become mine. Hands on heart, palm warm, eyes closed, breath as metronome. I said, softly, "I am presence. My steadiness is my law." The words were not a spell so much as a posture. I slept. The auction day arrived like any other calendar event. It passed through my life with more paperwork than shouts, more formality than drama. My phone vibrated with updates that read like weather reports. In the end, the scheduled actions were postponed. A creditor filed a claim that needed review. The world rearranged its clocks. I signed papers, handled calls, paid fees I could find, and renegotiated others. It was not victory in the heroic sense. It was work. It was life moving under a new set of muscles. Afterward, standing under the magnolia that shaded the entrance to the property, I felt not triumph but a clean, domestic recognition. This is stewardship, not destiny. I was given a house, yes. But what I had really been asked to manifest was my capacity to inhabit the world differently. There was, in those days, one last visit from the field, circumstantial, quiet. An old client I had thought lost called to ask about a listing I had closed months earlier. He spoke simply, with humility. "Sergio," he said, "I don't know what you did, but thank you for being steady." The words landed softer than any congratulation. They were proof that steadiness makes a sound the world can answer. And still, a question hovered in my chest like a small bird. If the field answers to felt certainty, what then is the moral of using this ability? How do I hold power without making it an altar for vanity? The answer waited not in a trumpet of arrival, but in the presence of one more evening, one more meeting, one more choice to practice the thing widely. I did not yet know the final shape of that answer, but I was learning to recognize the sound of the field replying, patient, incremental, honest. It would speak again, and that time the reply would not be paper or partial favor. It would be clarity pulled like a thread through a seam. That promise sat at the edge of every steady breath, waiting. I felt Zayla's presence then, not as a visitation, but as a corridor of possibility, thin light at the door. The next conversation with him, when it came, would not be instruction but integration. I was being invited to translate that possibility into language I could speak in public. I would be asked to say, in simple, human lines, what being a creator really required. A deeper test was still coming, one that would ask me to make the teaching public and practical at the same time. It would demand that I take what lived inside and let it organize outside, where other people's skepticism lived like weather. I closed my eyes and, in the dark, Let myself say the new loop I was forming. I am steady. I let form follow when my hands are calm. The loop was small. It fit my throat. It felt true. The field hummed faintly back, like a chord you kept. There was only the tight, patient presence of a being that had learned the grammar of waiting. I will not give you another test, he said. His voice moved like a coin dropped into water, small ripples, precise. You have passed the mechanical trials. Now the instruction must be embodied. The air cooled around us. I felt the usual physical reactions, skin prickling, breath speeding. Then, because I had practiced, I let them pass. This time I wanted his words to be actionable. I needed a code, not a sermon. He lifted a hand, and the light between his fingers arranged itself into a thin lattice, like paper cut into patterns. You were taught to declare, he said. Now learn to enact. The field does not respond to wishes. It responds to the grammar of your being. You will translate feeling into syntax. He did not explain with metaphors. He used small, exact verbs. Name what you hold. Hold it with the body. Speak in the simple present. Allow consequence to be practical. I wanted to object, to ask for examples, for rituals. He gave me both, not as prescriptions, but as experiments. He outlined 3 practices: small, repeatable, and operable. The first was posture as law. He asked me to stand, barefoot, to feel the ground as a surface that would answer. Feel the weight of certainty in your feet before you speak, he instructed. I did. The soles of my feet registered the small temperature gradients of the floor, the grit near the skirting. I stood as if anchored by a nail through the center of the earth. He watched silently, then said, "This posture calibrates the nervous system. Words cannot anchor what the body will not hold." The second was phrase as instrument. He asked me to reduce sentences to their minimum efficacious form, lines that my muscles could hold and that the world could echo. He gave examples, but not the words. He taught the method. Choose a specific, present tense phrase that names an embodied fact, not a desire. Test it for taste in your mouth. If it feels like bragging, refine. If it feels hollow, return to sensation. I practiced there on the floor of the new house. I tried a handful of lines. I am steady. I own this day. The house is safe. Each one landed differently in my chest. I tested the favorite for its sound in air and in my body. It had to feel like a muscle contracting, not like a wish. The third practice was translation. Apply the state to a small action immediately. If you say you are steady, then pay a small debt with steadiness. Call a contractor with patience. Reply to the bureaucrat's email without reactivity. The field does not separate feelings from consequences. It responds when the inner state is repeated into the world as behavior. He watched me try this threefold method across a week. I would stand, breathe, choose a phrase, then act. In the market I stood at a stall and said, in my head, I am steady. I bought fruit without haggling, with a calm attention that made the vendor slow his own breath. At a repair site, I said the line and negotiated with a contractor who then suggested a cheaper, more honest route. Small tests, yes, but cumulative. The field likes a patient ledger. Zayla's teaching was never grand. It came in little ironies. You wanted the field to do your work. The field wanted you to do your work differently. He smiled, and the edges of his voice calmed like water finding a channel. He anchored the lesson in language I could use aloud. He gave me a loop, short and hard. It was not a slogan. It was an operating system. He asked me to speak it 3 times, for 3 mornings in a row, as a public claim. I speak from steadiness. I act from clarity. I let the world rearrange. I said the loop in the morning light, in the bathroom mirror before a meeting, in the car before a negotiation. It fit my throat like a tuning fork. Saying it changed the shape of my gestures. My hands moved differently. In 1 week, a vendor returned my call and offered a discount without prompt. In another, a tenant who had been late for months showed up with cash and an embarrassed apology. The loop did not make luck. It taught my attention. Zayla's explained the mechanism not with equations, but with practical analogy. Emotion is frequency. Thought is vector. Certainty is the amplifier. Emotion gives the pitch. Thought points that pitch. Certainty provides the power. He did not invent a system for me. He asked me to become the system. I asked then the question that had been nesting in me. Will this always work? Am I safe from using it to harm? What about those who would suffer if I claim? He answered simply, responsibility is always the missing variable. Power without restraint becomes noise. Use the field as instrument and not as a hammer. He then did something unexpected. He placed a small object into my palm. The blue crystal he had given in our first nights, only now smaller, like a pebble refracted down. This is a reminder, he said. It carries no power you do not. It will remind you when you forget the posture. I held it. It was cool, weighty. My hand knew a memory of other nights. He watched me with a look that felt like farewell. You will be tested by those closest to you. They will try to make your potency into their mirror. That is not rebellion. It is human fear. Hold steady. When he began to dissolve into the room, he left me with one last instruction, less directive and more of a tone. Turn comprehension into language. Make the invisible speakable. Teach when you can. Be careful with whom you teach. The field obeys fidelity. After he left, the house felt both enormous and intimate. The crystal sat on my palm like a small star. The symbol on my wrist, which had pulsed and then faded through various arcs of brightness, glowed once, a final pulse, and then it fused with my skin. There was no theatrical vanishing, only the quiet sense that something had been internalized. The mark warmed briefly and then settled into ordinary flesh. No relic remained. The knowledge had migrated. I spent the next days not in exaltation, but in the awkward work of integration. The practices had to become mundane. I taught no one yet. Instead, I wrote the phrases on slips of paper and left them in drawers as if planting seeds. I practiced the posture whenever a pressure point arrived, before calls, contracts, conversations where the old reflex of smallness might return. At the center of this work were loops I recited like a metronome, short and non-ornamental, each with a small variance I could use depending on circumstance. The loops were not slogans to post, they were verbs for my muscles. Loop A, I stand steady. I speak careful. The world arranges. Loop B, breath opens the door, my voice walks through. Loop C, I name the fact, I act from the fact. They were simple, and they fit my throat. Saying them rewired how I moved my hands, how I read a message, how my eyes held another person when they spoke. I tested these loops in real situations that mattered. When a contractor raised his voice, I stood with my feet on the wood, hands relaxed, and said under my breath, breath opens the door, my voice walks through. I did not yell back. The contractor, who had been a habitual escalation artist, softened within 2 minutes and proposed a collaborative solution. The result saved money. The loop had not been a charm. It had been an orientation. Another time, a journalist called with the thin smell of skepticism in his questions. The old me would have folded, supplied drama, guarding the miracle as if it were a secret handshake. Instead, I used loop A out loud, mid-sentence. I stand steady. I speak careful. The world arranges. My answers came with less need to prove and more clarity. The interview became a human exchange rather than a trial. The article, when it ran, did not sensationalize. It told a quiet story of a man who had claimed steadiness and practiced it. The real proof, though, was not in articles or deals. It was in the small domesticities sleep that returned, the ease in my shoulders that allowed me to look at invoices without a storm, the ability to take Mario's silence without letting it dictate my worth. The loops taught me to let my inner voice become an ally rather than an enemy. One evening, as the sun thinned into a ribbon over the trees, I sat at a table and wrote down the code for myself, short instructions that turned insight into habit. Wake with stance, speak with present tense facts, act immediately on the felt truth. Fold, repeat, teach quietly, repeat. I understood then what Zaylas had meant by translation. Knowledge that is not expressed is not embodied. The field had been responding all along, but now I had a grammar that shaped my day. The crystal was no longer an object, but an anchor of intent. When it did not shield me from drama, it shifted how I entered it. Word spread in economy-level ripples. Ricardo liked my steadiness and recommended me to an acquaintance. A young client came to the mansion to ask about flipping a property and left with a different kind of coaching. People began to call, not because of mystique, but because of a mode of being they found dependable. In my phone, the pattern changed from panic pings to scheduling calls, queries that could be answered. The life I had longed for, steady income, dignity, time to breathe, arrived in incremental ways. I invited Eduardo and Diana to dinner after weeks of practicing the posture when I thought of them. The invite was not framed as reconciliation theater. It was an experiment in presence. I wanted to see how the method held when the old pain was in the room. The mansion served roast chicken and a salad that smelled of basil and lemon. The tablecloth was unshowy. The light was soft. They arrived with that fragile civility people wear when they anticipate emotional work. Eduardo's handshake was professional, like the man he had become. Diana looked at the house with an appraisal in her eyes, then softened. We sat. I could have begun with a story of betrayal or an attempt at blame. Instead, I did the small thing I had learned to do. I held my posture and spoke from fact. I am grateful for this evening, I said. I am at a place where I can gather. I do not ask for what cannot be given. I only offer this room. Silence spread, not heavy but clear. Eduardo's face loosened. Diana put down her fork and said, carefully, "You seem different." She was right. I was. Nothing theatrical followed, no confessions that would require more than was due. We spoke about houses, about what it means to steward spaces, about the strange economy of regret. At one point, Eduardo, without apology but with something like admission, said, "You always loved the places between people." It was a small bridge. I accepted it. The field had not asked them to apologize. It had asked me to let my posture do the reconciling work I could handle without surrendering my dignity. That dinner did not remake our past. It changed the present. For the first time since the split, I felt my chest unburdened in their presence. The practice had taught me that reconciliation is not always an exchange of apologies. Sometimes it is simply the steady presence of a different person in the same room. The mansion also required practical tending. Properties do not care for themselves. There were contractors with their timelines, tenants with their tempers, city officials with their forms. The work was ordinary and thorough. I applied the loop: speak from steadiness, act from clarity in concrete ways. I negotiated new schedules for repairs. I held tenants to clear, kind expectations. Small economies rebalanced. A peculiar thing happened with Mario. He called one morning after months of silence. We met in the cafe where we had once planned deals and traded jokes like currency. He watched me as if taking inventory. I expected suspicion. Instead, after a long pause, he said, "I misread this, Sergio. I thought you ran from shame. You just stood up differently." There was no fanfare. He did not ask for permission to return to old closeness. We made room then, quietly, as if beginning a new contract between us. His return was not a vindication of the method, but a human consequence of me being available despite his judgment. I began to take small opportunities to pass the work forward. Not in masses, not in grand promises, but in one-on-one moments. A tenant who wanted steadiness in his financial life came by and asked what I did. I invited him into the practice room, showed him how to stand, to speak one simple phrase, to test it in a small action that week. He paid the first month's rent and returned 2 months later with a calmer tone. He had not conjured a miracle. He had made a tiny habit that shifted his conduct. I learned moderation in teaching. The field is not for everyone. People come to practice with different hearts. Some receive it as medicine, others view it as wishful thinking. My job was not to convince. It was to offer the method and let its fidelity test itself in real life. If the practice changed the person, it would show in their actions. There were costs. Fame did not follow, but gossip did. Some in my old neighborhood spoke of strange bedside rituals. A colleague assumed I had a patron luck, they said. There was the small cruelty that human mouths are trained for, to make smiling comments to one who has dared. Yet the body had learned a new barometer. When insult or mockery arrived, I practiced the posture and answered in the smallest possible truthful language. More often than not, the attack withered not because I had a better argument, but because my hands did not tremble. One evening, months in, I took the crystal Zaylas had left and set it on the low table in the practice room. I touched it and felt the trace of our early nights. The mark on my wrist was gone. Where it had been, my skin bore only the faint memory of blue as if painted by the mind. That was when I understood something tender. The field does not need marks to be operative. It needs a converted life. A neighbor rang my bell one rainy day. Her eyes were red. She had lost her job and was about to be evicted. She came to me because she had seen the steady way I answered the door. We sat at my kitchen table while the rain tapped a slow code on the window. I taught her nothing grand. I taught posture and one phrase. I have one small claim, calm. She repeated it until the words fit. Then we drafted a letter to her landlord, calm and factual, proposing a payment plan. The landlord agreed. Not every story would close like that, but this one did. It felt like the work being used as a tool rather than an idol. In time, I realized the mansion was less a symbol of arrival than a lab for the practice. I converted rooms into small arenas for ordinary transformation. I did not preach, I demonstrated. I opened my doors to a handful of people who asked for help and could do the work. The results were small and multiplied, the way compost produces greens. One night, looking up at the sky from the veranda, I asked the question I'd held for months. Was Zaylas external, or was he a form my mind took to teach me a language I already had inside? The air smelled of distant rain. The answer dissolved into something larger. It didn't matter. The point was practice. Whether he was an alien messenger or a personification of a neglected capacity did not change the fact that I had been moved to act. Before he left, Zaylas had said, "We do not choose those who do not choose themselves." At the time it had felt like a gentle closing of a door. Now I saw its edge. The field responds to absolute attention. Desperation sometimes opens the door. Sometimes steadiness opens it wider. I knew the story would follow me. Some would call it luck, others would call it madness. I accepted the social cost as part of the shape of change. My feet were on new wood. My hands had learned new methods. The practice had become my ethic. There is an invitation that lives at the edge of this story, a question I now offer softly. What would it be to stand, just for 10 minutes every morning, and say a simple fact out loud, something you can hold in your body, and then act immediately in line with that fact? The instruction is small, and it asks for fidelity rather than faith. I leave you with the loop that settled into my bones, the one I teach quietly to anyone who asks. Stand steady. Name the fact. Move immediately. Repeat. If you decide to try it, begin in a single room. Bare feet on wood. Breath like a metronome. Say aloud something small and true. Watch what the world does in response when your body believes you. Thank you for staying with this story. If you find yourself moved, share in the comments where you are, city, country, and a single sentence about a small claim you want to test. If this channel is new to you, a subscription helps us reach 1,000 people who want to practice honesty with their hearts. We are building a small laboratory of steadiness, one person at a time. The field waits, as it always has, patient, not hurried for your next command. This morning the light over the garden was thin and honest, like paper held up to the sun. I sat on the veranda with my hands wrapped around a cup that held the memory of heat. The air smelled of wet earth and lemon peel. My feet found the old wood of the step and the grain sang under my toes. Small things, true things. The crystal Zaylas left rests on the table. It throws a lattice of geometry across the ceiling when the sun slides through it. I watch those patterns as if they were maps. They are not talismans. They are reminders. Each line that falls is a sentence I once learned in practice. The body is the grammar. Words are the verbs. I think about the early nights, the cold, and there is a temptation to make the practice mystical and exotic technique to set on display. Resist that. The power is banal. It is in answering the phone without reactivity, in opening a letter with steady hands, in meeting a person who has hurt you, and keeping your voice even. The accumulation is slow. It is quiet. It is accountable. When I walk the halls of the mansion now, there are reminders of this arithmetic everywhere. Receipts filed in order, a calendar I respect, a practice room with a thin rug. People come, some curious, some skeptical. I have learned to offer the method sparingly. If someone asks, I show them how to stand. If they are willing, I ask them to name one small, provable claim for the week. The results vary, but the method tests itself in public life. A tenant who repeated the practice paid his rent on time and later told me he slept better. A colleague stopped escalating conversations and found her team listen more. Small proofs. No miracles trumpeted. There were costs. Gossip reached the blocks I used to walk. A friend pulled away, discomfort by a story they could not file in their ledger of normal. I accepted the friction as part of practice. When the world judges, stand with gentleness and less explanation. Actions do the translating for you. The crystal has lost the weight of myth in my hand. I rub it sometimes not for power, but to remember the posture. The mark on my wrist is gone. The habit remains. That is the lesson I carry. External marks are ephemeral. The more durable change is the conversion of pattern into habit. If you are still with me, I will offer one more concrete thing, an instruction you can try now, wherever you are. Stand, if you can, with bare feet. Close your eyes for a breath. Name one small, true fact out loud, no future promises. Not, I will, but I pay my rent this month, or I speak with calm today, or I close this file. Say it once, in the present tense. Then do one immediate action that aligns. Log into your banking app and set a reminder. Open your inbox and send a short reply. Fold the paper and put it in its place. Watch what changes in the texture of your attention. That is the experiment. I will give you one affirmation I use when doubt arrives. It is short and held in the chest. I am available to what is true. Repeat it 3 times when you feel collapse. Let your breath carry the words. Let the body answer them. I do not claim that this practice cures every wound. It does not promise health or remove systemic harm. It sharpens the instrument that is you. That sharpening matters in work, in money, in relationship. It also asks for ethics. Do not use steadiness to manipulate. Use it to hold your own clarity. Responsibility is the missing variable. You may ask whether Zales was real, or whether he was a shape my mind drew to teach what I already knew in some hidden room. The question becomes smaller now. Whether he was alien, dream, or late-night emergent image does not alter the practice. What matters is that I learned to move differently. The door opened. I walked through. The universe, in its indifferent way, corresponded. There is another thing that lives at the edge of my mornings, a quiet invitation. I do not have guru trappings. I have a room with a rug and a lamp. If you come with readiness, no spectacle, no big promises, we try a single loop. You can keep it or leave it. That has become my offering. Before I close, a small ceremonial thing. A minute of breathing to fold this down. Inhale for 3 counts. Hold 1. Exhale 4. Feel the feet. Name one fact out loud. Make one small movement. That is all. Fidelity over faith. If you stayed until the end, thank you. If this channel is new, a subscribe helps us reach 1,000 people who want to practice honesty with their hearts. If you feel moved, leave a comment with your city and one short sentence about a small claim you want to test. I read them. They matter. And finally, one last question to leave with you like a door ajar. What would happen in your life if, for 7 mornings, you said one true thing and then did one thing that matched it. The field waits. The experiment is simple. The portal is not dramatic. It opens for those who show up steady enough to walk through.